Ladies and gentlemen, let's get into the video. We're going to be talking all about Nintendo's NX console. Supposedly it will be utilizing the Polaris architecture, have full Vulkan support. In fact, that's going to be the de facto API. Be twice the performance of the PlayStation 4, and launch with such titles as Luigi's Mansion 3, of course. So with that said, let's get into this. I did want to cover this earlier, but instead of just rushing out with a video, I really wanted to do some in-depth analysis of this, hence why I'm putting out a little bit later. This is also a full article. If you want to go ahead and check it out, it will of course be linked in the video's description. With all that said, we're going to get into this. Now, there's an awful lot to discuss, so I guess the first thing we should start out with is the GPU. So actually wait, before we go any further, let's talk about the source of the rumours. So the rumours actually come from NeoGAF. There's a verified poster on there by the name of 10K. Now 10K has a lot of ties in the industry, and basically after a lot of vetting, these sources have told him, I guess you could say, things that would break the NDA. So obviously he can't say, hey, it's Bob over at EA, or John over at Ubisoft, or what have you. In fact, he's really being under stringent conditions to keep their names as secretive as possible, and therefore, for the most part, he is simply relaying their information as various tiers and from sources he trusts. And obviously, from NeoGAF's point of view, they have verified that he is someone with those ties in the industry. But now we're going to get on with the GPU stuff. I just wanted to give you that information up front. Do remember, these are rumours, these are not Nintendo's official confirmations, but it's looking pretty genuine. So according to the rumour mill, the NX's GPU will be a customised Polaris-based chip. Now, you might remember that the PlayStation 4K is an upcoming evolution of the PS4 and will be about twice the performance of the vanilla system, and supposedly that's what the NX is targeting as well. This means that both the NX and the PS4K will offer around 3.6 to 4 teraflops of computing performance, compared to the PlayStation 4's 1.84-ish teraflops of computing performance, which is quite the difference. Now, there is an awful lot of focus being placed on the fact that these GPUs are going to be 14nm. So this basically means that the current GCN architecture, the same architecture you'll find in your PC, on the PlayStation 4, on the Xbox One, is manufactured at 28nm. Shrinking things down to 14nm allows a lot more transistors in the same space. You get to run a higher clock speeds, reduce power consumption, and a whole bunch of other stuff. But really, that's just the tip of the iceberg. Simply running things at a higher clock speed or adding in a whole bunch of shaders isn't necessarily the only way to improve performance. One of those is efficiency. Now, AMD have actually given some information of the 4th generation of GCN architecture, once again Polaris, and what they're doing for that. Now, I'm going to read out a whole bunch of words and then I'm going to explain what they are. I'm going to go over this pretty briefly because otherwise I'm going to be here for some time. I have also written this as an article where I go into it slightly more detail, and then of course you could feel free to do your own Googling as well. So there's primitive discard accelerator, hardware scheduler, instruction prefetch, improve shader efficiency, and finally memory compression. We're going to start out with the easiest one first. It's memory compression. Memory compression has been around for a long ass time on GPUs, but this is basically just an improvement of that, although we don't know exactly what those improvements are. Essentially all memory compression is just, well, reducing the size of data. So, for example, if you've ever used WinZip, you know what the hell, or WinRAR, or whatever, you know what the hell memory compression is. All you're doing is basically making a file and making it smaller. It's important to remember that this is not lossy compression. There's lossless and there's lossy. So, lossless basically means you're not damaging the data, you're not discarding data, whereas lossy compression is a JPEG. For example, let's say you've got Photoshop installed, or Paint, or what have you. You open up an image, and then you take that photograph, and then you save it at a very, very, very low quality JPEG. What happens? It looks like garbage, right? Well, that's basically what lossy compression is. Lossless compression doesn't do that. It will, for example, in some cases look for instances where it has a whole bunch of colors which are the same. For example, a whole bunch of pixels might be pure green, in which case that it can just say, hey, I don't need to remember all of that data, I just need to remember all of those are green. Done. I'm very much simplifying it, but you get the idea. Primitive discard accelerator is a little more complex, and without giving a full in-depth analysis of the rendering pipeline of graphics cards, the best way I can describe it is that scenes are made of millions of triangles. Now, as a scene is created, you might think that it's instantaneous, but in reality there are multiple steps for it, particularly when you start factoring in lighting and that type of thing. There is also deferred and forward rendering, but that's well outside the scope of this video. So let's make things as basic as possible. The more complex a scene is, the greater the burden is on the GPU, because it needs to draw more stuff. Similarly, some objects, just in real life, like if you were to look around a room, for example, there are going to be some objects which are blocked from view compared to another one. So, for example, if you look outside, you might find that your car is half blocked by a wall. So, imagine, for example, that this scene was in a computer. Now, is there a point in the GPU, in the system itself, rendering the car if it's hidden? No is the obvious answer, right? Because if it can't be seen, what's the point in the GPU drawing it only for something else to be laid over the top of it a few moments later? So what happens here is with primitive discard accelerator, it will very early in the rendering scene, rendering pipeline, excuse me, during the primitive stage, it will basically do a test and say, hey, is this going to be visible on screen, or is it going to be obscured by something? If it's going to be invisible, if it's going to be obscured by something, then it won't go through the rest of the graphics pipeline, for example, geometry processing and then lighting and all of the other stages which are essential to making the scene look good on your TV screen. Hopefully I've explained that pretty well. Hardware scheduler and instruction prefetch, I'll go over those very briefly. With instruction prefetch, it basically means you're fetching instruction ahead of when the GPU needs it. It basically will, in this case, store an instruction in, for example, cache, and then once, let's say, for example, you've got instruction A and B. A is the instruction that's being processed. B is the instruction that is waiting to be processed. Instruction A is being, therefore, processed right now. The GPU, in this case the instruction prefetch, will grab instruction B, put it in cache. Instruction A is finished processing. Instruction B therefore moves forward to be processed, and instruction C is therefore grabbed and put in, once again, cache. You get the idea. Slightly simplified, but you understand. Hardware scheduler is a little more complex. All you need to know is that there are a lot of components inside a GPU. Thousands of processors go in to make a graphics card, a modern day graphics card. In the case of the PlayStation 4, you've got 1152 shaders, God knows how many in the PS4K. This means that for the GPU to function efficiently, those shaders, those processors need to be always full. They always need to be 100% workload, because otherwise you're not utilizing the hardware as much as possible. Now, what this will do, hardware scheduling, is it will take the workload off of the software, for example, the CPU, and instead it will make the GPU do the work. It will have a little, section on the die which will say, hey, you are going to be responsible for scheduling work across all of these shaders and making sure that they are being utilized as efficiently and as fast as possible. This basically means you're going to get less bubbles in the graphics pipeline. All bubbles are is, I guess you could say, a section, or rather a slice in time, where the graphics card is not rendering something, or where something's not happening. For example, it could be that instruction is waiting to be fetched. It could be that instruction is waiting to be processed. For example, let's say you've got two shaders. Let's make things really simple. Let's say you've got shader A and B. It could be that shader A is still processing data, but shader B is not processing data, but that data needs to be synced up because processor B has finished, processor A hasn't finished. But for the output, let's say for sake of argument you're trying to do a very basic mathematical equation. So 1 plus 1 on shader A, 2 plus 2 on shader B. You can't let's say you want to get that result, you can't find out what that result is until you know the sum of both of them. So, for example, if you know that 2 plus 2 is 4, but you don't know what 1 plus 1 is because the processor hasn't actually calculated that yet, it can't tell you what C is. It can't tell you what the result is. Therefore, in this case, the processor needs to wait for those to happen, and that's why hardware scheduling and improved efficiency are so important. Hopefully I've made that really understandable. I'm trying to get through this pretty quickly, but at the same time be fairly informative. Basically, all we're doing here is keeping the GPU's pipeline as busy as possible, and that's the same for all hardware resources. Speaking of hardware resources, what does that mean for the rest of the system? Because there were some rumours that we could be seeing an ARM-based processor. Well, that's looking very unlikely, because if obviously AMD are providing the GPU, it makes a lot more sense for them to push an x86 processor as well, especially when we start talking about the Linux rumours and some other stuff we'll go into in just a moment. Now, what's quite interesting, however, is that while the PlayStation 4K is being known as the 4K, the main reason behind that is supposedly streaming. So, despite the fact that the GPU is going to be twice the performance, that does not necessarily mean that the NX is even slightly going to be able to render at 4K. Technically, it would be able to, obviously, but not with high degrees of graphical fidelity, because the GPU to render at 1080p requires only 1/4 of the performance as it does at 4K. There's an awful lot of difference. So what the hell are we going to probably see on the NX compared to the PS4, for example, is either higher frame rates or more stable frame rates, better shadows, better texture detail, maybe higher levels of draw distance, better geometry. In short, the game's just going to look aesthetically better, but at a more regular resolution, for example 1080p. For example, you could have an instance where the game might run at 900p at 30 FPS with some frame rate drops on the regular PS4, whereas on the NX/PS4K it would run at 1080p with maybe slightly nicer anti-aliasing, with once again a hard-locked 30 FPS or maybe higher, and that would be obviously a really good thing for the gamer. One of the earlier rumours, and actually the earlier rumour from 10K himself, was that his sources have told us that the system is, and I quote, optimised for gaming. Now that might not sound a particularly descriptive rumour, but it does let you know that the system most likely is going to be, I guess you could say, no frills. It means that the system is going to be created with gaming in mind, and therefore one can make the assumption that there are going to be less, let's say, streaming options, less Netflix options, that type of stuff. Obviously, it's potentially possible it will be, but my guesstimate, based upon what we're seeing here, is that Nintendo are really pushing towards a game-orientated system. The reason that's important is it kind of dictates what's going to happen with the memory. The PS4 and Xbox One have 8 GB. The memory types are different, but we're only talking about size here, not speed. So there's 8 GB available, and both systems have around 5 GB available for games. Now, it stands to logical reason that if the NX is going to have higher fidelity graphics, that would be either better shadows, better textures, what have you. Memory is also going to need to be bumped up for those applications, because memory gets eaten up quickly. It really does. Textures alone can eat up massive amounts of memory, and then when you start to deal with other things, for example audio data, when you start dealing with frame rate, when you start dealing with render targets, when you start dealing with various buffers and all of that stuff, it eats memory alive. And so it's most likely that you're going to start seeing an 8 GB NX would not be out of realms of potential possibility. Potentially we could see even more memory. I mean, there is a possibility that you could see 16 GB, but I think it would be too expensive. That's my guess anyway. I mean, I got proven wrong with the PlayStation 4. I said that the PS4, there's no way they were going to have 8 GB of memory, and To be fair, most people didn't think that the PS4 was going to have 8GB, and Sony went ahead and took the financial hit for that. But I don't think Nintendo will, but we might be wrong. They could quite easily, however, cram in 7GB of memory available for games developers, and that would be pretty darn awesome. It would mean quite the difference in memory, and 2GB of memory, or even if they decided to go for 6.5, it makes quite the difference overall. It's less known what's going to happen with the CPU. We could potentially see a Zen-based processor, or we could see an evolution of the APU which is being used in the PS4, but much like when we were talking about the PS4K and its analysis, it makes much more sense for a more stronger, faster processor, simply because if Nintendo did decide to go the Jaguar route, there is certainly room left in the Jaguar tank, because the highest clock speed you can go for is about 2 GHz. But adding more CPU cores is certainly out of the question. It just makes things way too complex for game developers. Therefore, most likely you're either going to see a very high clock Jaguar, or potentially a new APU processor entirely, for example Zen, which does happen to come out about the same time. Unfortunately, we know basically bupkis when it comes to AMD's Zen lineup of APUs. All we know is there are going to be large improvements IPC, which is instructions per clock. All that means is that if you're running a processor at 2 GHz on an older architecture from AMD, with Zen you're going to get up to maybe slightly more, maybe slightly less, depending on the task, 40% faster performance. I emphasize the fact that I say per clock because, once again, because we know so little about Zen in APU form, we don't know what those clock speeds are going to be, and also the number of CPU cores and other bits and pieces. For example, the high-end Zen on the desktop can have 8 CPU cores, and each of those cores can run 2 threads each. So that's 16 threads, which is kind of crazy. I want to touch one last thing on the hardware side of things before we move away from this, and that is memory. Now, I know I did already mention about the quantity of memory, but I did want to touch just briefly on memory speeds. So, as you're aware, the PlayStation 4 has GDDR5 memory, and it's probable that we're going to see Nintendo decide to use very similar. I'm hoping they don't go the ESRAM/EDRAM route. They kind of did for other systems, but hopefully they're just going to use unified memory. So let's assume that they do use unified memory, which is an assumption. It doesn't necessarily mean it's true. What can we expect? As I said, the PS4 is using putting out 176 gigabytes per second of bandwidth, but that is for an older GCN hardware. Now, since then, we've had Tonga, which for this video we're going to call GCN3, and we've had Polaris, which we're going to dub the 4th generation. Now, each of those has improvements when it comes to compression and basically how it deals with data. Tonga, and these are official comments actually from AMD to me when I was reviewing the R9 285 back. I can't actually remember when I reviewed the R9 285, but it was very similar to when I also reviewed the R9 380 as well. But essentially, they told me that the Tonga reduced bandwidth requirements by about 40%. I'm not going to go into the complexities of that. I've linked that in the article, which is linked in the video description, because otherwise I'm going to be here way too long already. But you can therefore make the assumption that Polaris is going to make another jump. I'm not going to say it's 40%. I'm going to say it's another 10, maybe 15% on top. I'm going to be conservative rather than boastful. So let's say that a 50-ish% improvement in memory bandwidth performance, rather a reduction. Therefore, you're only going to need around 200 gigabytes per second to feed the beast. Let's call it 230, assuming a very high-end processor. That's quite achievable on GDDR5 with a fairly modest system bus, for example, 256. Therefore, Nintendo could opt to use GDDR5X. 5X offers higher amounts of performance over GDDR5. It's 14 gigabits per second versus 7. But the chips are very slightly more expensive, and honestly, while they do consume less power if you're using a lot of chips especially, it doesn't really make sense. And for those wondering, well, what about high bandwidth memory too? There's absolutely no point using HBM for a couple of reasons. One, vast quantities of it are not going to be available this year. Two, it would drastically jack up the price. Three, there's just no need to, because unless you're only using one stack of HBM2, in which case you wouldn't have the amount of memory available anyway, and a couple of stacks or more, just way too much memory bandwidth. There's absolutely no point. This is basically way overcooking the egg. So, with all that said, I want to touch on Vulkan. Vulkan, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the backstory, Vulkan is an evolution of Mantle. Mantle was actually AMD's proprietary API, low-level API, and actually kick-started both DirectX 12 and Vulkan. Now, Vulkan is administered by the Kronos Group, who actually Nintendo back in the day, well, I'll say back in the day, they recently joined. Now, all of that means is Vulkan is going to be the successor to OpenGL, which has been around from day dot. It's been around for ages, like, we're talking Quake 1 type of, back in the day. Now, with all of that said, according to 10K, the current SDK is not supporting Vulkan. It's a future update which is going to happen in May. The current SDK, by the way, is dated December. That's of last year, 2015. So right now, what are developers using? What are they using? Well, they're using GNMX. And if that sounds familiar to you, that's because it's Sony's API. It's the same API that's used in the PlayStation 4. Now, supposedly, Nintendo, and I quote, are providing nice tools, which allows the NX to easily port from the PC, Xbox One, and the PS4 without too much hardship. Now, one of the benefits of all of this is Vulkan itself is very well supported, and it's an upcoming API. It's not nowhere near as far along, actually. It's being released even later than DirectX 12. It's very well supported in the industry. There's everyone from AMD, Nvidia, you've got obviously Nintendo, you've got a lot of smartphone manufacturers, tons of companies applying this damn thing. And it's also natively supported with numerous game engines, for example, Unreal Engine, Unity, and it should theoretically mean that porting between different platforms is actually pretty darn simple. So, what about the NX's gimmick? Come on, you knew there was going to be one. You knew it. You knew it. Just admit it to yourself. Just stare at yourself in the mirror and say, yeah, I knew it. So, while the GameCube was a strictly gaming machine, it just had a pad and a few other bits, Nintendo since then have always wanted to push something on us. We had the Wiimote, we've had the Wii U pad, which personally I wasn't much of a fan of, but supposedly the NX is going to have an evolution of the Wii U pad. Now, it's a screen controller, but one of the things which remains unclear is whether it's the only method of controlling the system or not. The actual controller was compared to, and I quote, a dummy Vita. Now, I'm going to read out a very short quote to you. It'll likely have basic OS functions to access the NX console from anywhere, like a tiny CPU. Nintendo will enhance the Wii U gamepad streaming technology and allow the controller, to be taken anywhere. Connect the NX console at home, likely through Wi-Fi or personal hotspots, and the NX console will likely have its standby mode. Basically, it's remote play built into the box and won't require a $200 add-on to experience it. That's likely why we had Kimimishima, hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly, meant in an interview with Sankai, different ways to play with a dedicated machine and a whole new way to experience games mantra has been going around with Nintendo's PR. End quote. Alright, so you heard a whole bunch about the technical side of things. What about the games? Because let's face it, if the system's released and it's got 0, you're not going to buy it, right? Pretty much stands to reason. Now, we've already heard about certain games are going to get ported. Zelda is basically confirmed. We've also got Smash, we've got Splatoon. Basically, there's 4 games confirmed to be ported from the Wii U, and supposedly Nintendo are thinking of bringing over a couple of more. But here's one. Luigi's Mansion 3. So Luigi's Mansion, of course, originally debuted with the GameCube, and it was actually one of the best games on the system, and somehow I just did not play. Don't know how I managed to miss it. I know the game's bloody fantastic, but I didn't ever see it in stores when I had cash. It's just one of those things. Every time I bloody went out and I didn't bring my wallet or something, the game was there, and every time I came back to bloody well buy the damn thing, yeah, you can guess it. Anyway, so for some reason I just haven't bought it on eBay or whatever. I don't know why. Anyway, I'm digressing massively. So there are two different sources that have told him that it is in development for the NX. One source has told him that the game originally started as a Wii U title, but because of the performance of the Wii U, in other words, it isn't really performing very well, is it? Let's just be honest. Nintendo's decided, yeah, probably best to release it to a system that's actually, you know, possibly worth saving. I'm slightly misquoting that last bit, just for your FYI. Final Fantasy 15 is also potentially going to see a release. Final Fantasy 7 Remake, for those of you who are immediately going to ask, unsure. Basically, the reason behind that is because Sony may have contributed some cash, and I'm going to assume they won't be particularly pleased if they look at the Nintendo library and say, oh, look, Final Fantasy 7, it's not like we helped to make your Splendor or anything like that, right? So, unknown about that one. Final Fantasy 7 Remake will appear on the PS4, will appear on the PC, but we don't know if it's ever going to be appearing on anything else. I'm going to read out another quote which is not related to Final Fantasy but is related to Mario and other games. I asked this because I noticed some complaints there were no leaks about new IP, and NX was looking like another Mario/Zelda factory with a bunch of remastered ports. The source said, I'm not allowed to give specifics, but it is a sure bet in regards to new titles and new IPs being released for the system. That's pretty darn good. Now, finally, I'm going to leave you with disappointing news. Sadness, Giddy. And this comes down... Excuse me, I just caught the mouse. Whoops. This comes down to the 14nm FinFET process. Basically speaking, Nintendo are possibly going to be conservative. What they're going to do is potentially release the system only in 1 to 2 regions first, and then follow up later on. Now, 10K believes it's possible that those regions, this may or may not make you happy depending where you live right now, so brace yourself, get ready to emigrate, or, you know, just import the machine, depending. It's possible that, according to him at least, that we're going to see it in North America and Europe first. Now, before everyone goes on a rage, the reason behind that is because of the slower console sales in Japan and the East in general. They're really pushing towards portables and smartphones and PC gaming and whatever else. Therefore, it's probable Nintendo is thinking to themselves, well, it's better to have as many consoles as possible in regions where it's going to be bought, rather than potentially in regions where it's going to not fly off the shelves as fast. Having said that, I think that if they did release it in Japan with a good library of games, with the right support, with the right attitude, Nintendo could probably print money in Japan. But, once again, I'm just guessing. I think that's about it. Jesus, this turned into a long video. Hopefully you've enjoyed the video. Have you enjoyed the video? Let me know if you've enjoyed the video. With that said, I'll see you soon. Take care. Oh, and if you could do the likey, subscribe thing, that would be greatly appreciated. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.